The Lasserin Enigma. Part 1. The Beginning of a New Life. Charles Lasserin was an ordinary 13-year-old boy from a small, quiet town in the heart of France. He lived with his mother, father, and younger sister in a modest house overlooking the village square. While their home wasn't extravagant, it was filled with warmth, love, and the simple pleasures of life. Charles had always been a curious, energetic child with a passion for art and an eye for beauty in the world around him. From an early age, Charles demonstrated an incredible talent for drawing. He would spend hours sketching the scenes of the town square, capturing the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He drew the cobblestone streets, the narrow alleys between buildings, and the people he observed, their expressions, their movements. It wasn't just the world he was painting. It was the emotions, the stories behind each face and moment. His mother, a kind and supportive woman, always encouraged his creativity. One crisp autumn afternoon, Charles was playing soccer with his friends at school. He was known for his speed and athleticism, and soccer was one of his favorite activities. As he dashed across the field, chasing the ball, disaster struck. When he lunged to kick the ball, his opponent collided with him, and Charles was sent crashing to the ground. His head hit the hard earth with a sharp thud, and for a moment, everything went black. At first, Charles felt a sharp pain in his right eye, but he dismissed it as nothing serious. He was helped up by his friends, and despite his dizziness, he insisted he was fine. However, as the day wore on, the pain in his eye worsened, and soon he was finding it increasingly difficult to see clearly. By the time he got home, his vision was blurry, and his mother insisted they go to the hospital. The doctors were quick to act, running several tests, but the news was grim. The trauma to his eye had caused permanent damage. There was a possibility that he might lose his sight in that eye completely. Over the next few weeks, Charles underwent numerous surgeries, but despite their best efforts, his vision continued to deteriorate. As the days passed, the world around him seemed to change. The once vibrant and colorful world he had painted in his mind now appeared distant and hazy. His sketches, once filled with life and vibrancy, now seemed like distant memories. Charles felt as though a part of him had been taken away. The very thing that had made him who he was, his ability to see the beauty in the world, was slipping from his grasp. His friends and family tried to comfort him, but Charles began to withdraw. He stopped talking to his friends and refused to pick up his pencils or brushes. He couldn't bring himself to paint a world he could no longer see clearly. The darkness in his eye seemed to mirror the darkness he felt inside. He spent long days staring out the window, watching the world outside but feeling disconnected from it. It was as if a part of him had died, and all that was left was a hollow shell. Struggling with darkness. A few months had passed since the accident, and Charles felt as though he was trapped in a world of shadows. The vibrant colors he once loved to paint were now a distant memory, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation. The surgery and treatments hadn't helped much, and the doctors were unsure if he would ever regain full vision in his right eye. It felt like every day brought him closer to the realization that his artistic abilities, the very thing that made him unique, were slipping away. One quiet evening, Charles sat in his room, staring at his half-finished sketches that lay scattered on the desk. His right hand reached out, almost instinctively, to pick up a pencil, but then paused. He couldn't do it. What was the point? He couldn't even see the lines clearly anymore. Just then, his grandfather, Jean, walked into the room. Jean was a retired painter himself and had always been Charles's biggest supporter. He'd seen the boy's talent since he was a little child and had always encouraged him to pursue his dreams. Even now, seeing his grandson lost and defeated, Jean refused to give up on him. "Charles, you've been sitting here for too long," Jean said gently, taking a seat beside him. "I know you're struggling, but you've got to understand something. A painter's vision is not just about what they can see with their eyes. It's about what they can feel in their heart." Charles didn't answer right away. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to hear words that he thought sounded meaningless. But Jean's voice had a certain calmness that Charles found difficult to ignore. "You know, when I was your age, I lost something too," Jean continued, his voice soft yet firm. "Not my sight, but my faith in myself. I was told I couldn't be a painter, that I wasn't good enough. But you know what? I kept painting, and I learned that art is more than just what you can see. It's about what you can feel in your soul. Charles finally looked up at his grandfather, his eyes clouded with doubt. But Grandpa, I can't even see half the things I used to. I don't know how to paint like I did before. Gene placed his hand on Charles's shoulder. I understand, son, but trust me on this. Art is something that comes from deep inside you. You can still paint, even if you can't see it the way you did before. You have to find a new way to express yourself. Charles didn't know what to think. He wasn't sure if his grandfather was right, but something about his words made him feel a little less alone. Maybe it wasn't about what he had lost. Maybe it was about what he could still find. The next day, Charles went back to his studio. He hesitated at first, standing in front of his easel, unsure of what to do. But he remembered his grandfather's words, and slowly he picked up a brush and dipped it into some paint. He closed his eyes and started to feel the texture of the canvas beneath his fingertips. He didn't try to see. He just allowed his senses to guide him. For the first time in months, Charles painted with a sense of freedom. He couldn't see every detail clearly, but he could feel the emotion in every stroke. The colors were no longer just shapes and forms. They were sensations, memories, and dreams. It was a different kind of painting, but it was still painting. As he continued to work, Charles felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was still a way forward, even in the dark. Part 3. Finding New Vision. Weeks passed, and Charles kept painting. His right eye still struggled with clarity, but his confidence grew. He started experimenting with different techniques, embracing his limitations instead of being discouraged by them. Every day, he would work for hours, not caring if the results were perfect, because for the first time, the process itself became the reward. His family noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more focused, but there was a subtle shift in his energy. He wasn't just sitting around anymore, feeling sorry for himself. He was taking action, even if that action was uncertain and filled with challenges. One evening, as he was sketching some abstract shapes on his canvas, his mother walked into the room. She'd been watching him for a while, but hadn't wanted to interrupt his process. "Charles," she said softly, "you've been working so hard. How do you feel about all this?" Charles stopped and looked up at her, eyes still uncertain. "I don't know. It's different. I can't see the way I used to, but I think I'm starting to understand what Grandpa meant." His mother smiled warmly. "I'm proud of you, Charles. You've always had something special, and I can see that you're finding it again. Keep going." Her words were simple, but they held so much meaning. In that moment, Charles realized that the love and support of his family had been the silent force pushing him forward all this time. As the days turned into months, Charles's new way of painting became more refined. His works became known for their raw emotional depth and unique texture. Even though he could no longer see everything clearly, he learned to capture the intangible, the feeling of a moment, the soul behind a face. His paintings didn't just represent the world he could see. They represented the world he had learned to feel. One day, Charles received an unexpected invitation. It was from a prestigious art gallery in Paris, one of the most respected in the country. The letter was formal, but the message was clear. They wanted to showcase his work. This was a dream come true, but Charles felt torn. He wasn't sure if he was ready. His paintings were so personal, so raw, he wasn't sure how others would react to them. Would they understand the feeling behind the art, or would they see only the imperfections? "Do I really have what it takes?" he asked his grandfather one evening. Gene sat beside him, his eyes full of pride. "Charles, when I was young, I wondered the same thing. But I'll tell you this. It's not about perfection. It's about being true to yourself. Art doesn't have to be flawless to move people. It has to be real." Charles took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt ready. He had spent so much time doubting himself, but he had finally found a sense of peace within his art. His vision wasn't defined by the limits of his sight. It was defined by the vastness of his imagination, his heart, and his soul. The exhibition in Paris became a turning point in Charles's life. The gallery was filled with people from all walks of life, each one drawn to the intensity of his work. Some saw the vibrant colors, Others noticed the emotional depth. Charles had successfully found a way to communicate his inner world without the need for perfect vision. At the end of the night, the gallery director approached Charles. "Your work is extraordinary, young man," she said, smiling. "I've never seen anything like it. We want to feature you in our next show." Charles couldn't believe it. After all the doubts, all the fears, he had made it. He had found his way, not just as an artist, but as a person. His world had expanded beyond the limitations of his sight, and he had learned to see with his heart instead. Part 4. The Unexpected Challenge. Charles's life took a new turn after his successful exhibition in Paris. He became known as the artist who saw beyond the visible. Invitations to showcase his work flooded in from all over the world, but with the fame came new challenges, and Charles soon realized that navigating the art world was more complicated than he had imagined. Despite his growing success, there was a part of Charles that still struggled with his disability. The world around him was vibrant and full of life, but he couldn't always access it the way he wanted to. Sometimes he felt isolated in a crowd, as though the world was moving too fast for him to catch up. One evening, after returning home from another gallery opening, Charles sat on the porch, lost in thought. The stars above him were bright and countless, but they seemed distant, as though they were a world he could never truly touch. His hand rested on the railing, and he closed his eyes, focusing on the sensations around him. The gentle wind, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of the trees, it all felt so vivid, yet so unreachable. "I used to see everything clearly," he whispered to himself, "but now I feel like I'm just grasping at shadows." The voice of his grandfather, Jean, broke the silence. "The problem isn't that you can't see, it's that you're afraid of what you can't control." Charles turned to face him. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Jean smiled gently, walking over and sitting beside him. "I mean that sometimes we try to hold on to things we can no longer control. You can't control your vision, but you can control how you see the world. That's where your power lies." Charles pondered his words. He knew his grandfather was right, but the struggle between embracing his new reality and wishing for the old one was always present. The path to acceptance seemed endless, but he had made so much progress. Maybe it was time to face this challenge head on. A few weeks later, Charles received an unexpected call. A major art auction house in New York wanted to feature one of his paintings in an upcoming auction. It was a huge opportunity, but there was a catch. They wanted him to speak at the event, to share his story with the audience. It wasn't a request, it was a demand, and Charles knew it. His heart raced. The thought of speaking in front of a large crowd terrified him. He had always preferred letting his art do the talking, but this wasn't just about art anymore. This was about confronting his fears, about stepping out of the shadows and showing the world who he truly was. For days, Charles wrestled with the idea. He tried to avoid the decision, but his mind kept returning to it. Finally, he called his mother for advice. "What do you think, Mom? Should I do it?" She didn't hesitate. "Charles, you've been hiding from this moment for so long. It's time to stop running. You've got a story that people need to hear, not just about your art, but about who you are. Don't let fear hold you back." Her words were the push he needed. He agreed to attend the auction and speak. It wasn't just about selling a painting. It was about telling his truth, no matter how hard it was to say. The night of the auction arrived, and Charles found himself standing backstage, his palms sweaty and his heart pounding. He had prepared a speech, but the nerves were still overwhelming. He could hear the sound of the crowd murmuring, waiting for the event to begin. His thoughts swirled, and for a moment he considered backing out. But then he thought of his grandfather's words, "You can control how you see the world." With a deep breath, he walked onto the stage, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. He took a moment to collect himself, then began speaking. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "My name is Charles, and I'm here to share my story, not as an artist, but as a person who's learning to see the world in new ways." As he spoke, the fear began to fade. He wasn't speaking to impress anyone. He was speaking to be true to himself. The words flowed out raw and real, and the crowd listened intently. He shared his journey, the struggles, the doubts, the pain, and the triumphs. He spoke about his grandfather, who had taught him that vision was not just about what you see with your eyes, but how you feel with your heart. By the time he finished, there was a hushed silence in the room. For a moment, Charles thought he had failed, but then the applause started. It was loud and genuine, and for the first time in years, Charles felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced his fear, and in doing so, he had connected with people on a level he never thought possible. Part 5. A New Beginning. The night of the auction became a turning point in Charles's life. His speech, raw and genuine, resonated deeply with everyone in the room, not just for the powerful message, but for the vulnerability he had shown. It was a moment that marked the beginning of something new, not just in his career, but in his personal journey. The following months brought even more success. Charles's paintings began selling at record prices, and invitations to galleries and exhibitions poured in. But more importantly, he started to receive letters and messages from people who had been inspired by his story. They weren't just talking about the art. They were talking about his courage to live authentically, to embrace the imperfections of life, and to overcome the barriers that held them back. One day, while Charles was walking through Central Park, he received a letter that would change his life. It was from a young artist named Emma, who had heard him speak at the auction. She was also visually impaired, and she had been struggling with self-doubt for years. Her letter was heartfelt and filled with gratitude. "Your story gave me the strength to pick up my brush again," she wrote. "I see now that my art doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be true." Charles smiled as he read her words. It was moments like this that made all the struggles worth it. His journey had never been about fame or fortune. It had always been about finding his voice and sharing it with the world. Now, that voice was reaching far beyond anything he had imagined. He wrote back to Emma, offering encouragement and sharing his own experiences. He told her that the beauty of art wasn't in its perfection, but in its ability to connect. He invited her to join him at his next exhibition, where he would unveil a new piece that he had been working on for months, a painting he called The Journey. At the opening of the exhibition, Charles stood before a large canvas, the lights shining down on it. The piece was bold, filled with colors and textures that seemed to come alive. It wasn't perfect by traditional standards, but it was honest and raw. The crowd stood in awe, but for Charles, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the feeling of finally being free, free to express himself fully, without fear, without doubt. As the night went on, Emma arrived at the gallery. Charles saw her across the room, and their eyes met. She walked toward him, a shy smile on her face. They exchanged a few words before Charles took her to the front of the gallery, where The Journey was displayed. "This is the painting that changed everything for me," he said softly. Emma studied it for a long time, taking in every detail. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. "I see it now. I see how it tells a story, how it's not just a picture, but a piece of you. It's beautiful." Charles nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just creating art for himself. He was creating art for others, for those who needed to hear his story, to see the world through his eyes. As the evening came to a close, Charles stood outside the gallery, looking up at the stars. He thought of all the people who had helped him along the way. His grandfather, his mother, the friends who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And he thought of Emma, who now had the courage to pursue her own dreams. In that moment, Charles realized that his journey was far from over. He had only just begun to explore the endless possibilities that lay ahead. The world was full of challenges. Yes, but it was also full of beauty, and he was ready to embrace all of it. As the stars twinkled above, Charles felt the weight of his fears lift. He had learned that it wasn't the obstacles in life that defined him. It was how he chose to face them. And now, more than ever, he was ready to see the world not as a place full of limitations, but as a canvas waiting for him to paint his truth. And so, with a heart full of hope and a soul brimming with possibility, Charles stepped forward into the next chapter of his life. It was a chapter he knew would be full of challenges, but it was also one that would be filled with the beauty of discovery, creativity, and the joy of embracing life in all its forms.